this today. All right, so let me start sharing my screen. Let's see here. I'm going to go to the whole thing. All right, so I'll just do it this way. Go ahead. Give me just a second here.
Try it again.
Okay. There we go. That puts us in the slideshow mode. All right. Okay, so this is a presentation related to the DNA evidence supporting the Book of Mormon. In a second. All right, so there on the right side of the screen, you see the book that a copy of the book that I've written. In this presentation, we'll go ahead. What?
I'm not seeing your screen for some reason.
Oh, you're not seeing the screen?
Let's check with others.
Okay.
I've got it.
We are.
I've got
I
it.
see it fine.
I can see it.
I have it fine.
Okay. All right, then
I'll
I'll
just start over.
all right, Paul, do you still not see it?
I still don't. Let me shut down and come back. I may have just.
I've got it.
Okay.
Yeah, if you got everybody else, go ahead.
All right, I'll go ahead. Okay, so and what I'll do with each of the slides, there are about 30 slides approximately, and each one I'll leave up for a minute or so people can read what's on the slide, and then I'll kind of talk along as it goes. So the book is called Face of a Nephite. It relates to the different scientific evidence supporting the Book of Mormon. Focuses mostly on the DNA evidence. It also has some information related to blood type evidence related to the Book of Mormon. All right. Now, most of you will know that in 2014, the church published the Book of Mormon and DNA Studies. It was a gospel topics essay, and in it, the church explained that the then available genetic evidence was inconclusive and neither proves nor disproves the Book of Mormon, and the gospel topics essay took some time to explain why that was. In this presentation, I'll provide additional evidence that was not in that DNA gospel topics essay, but the evidence here does not conflict with the gospel topics essay. It just provides some additional evidence. First, preliminary question is that some may think about is, why does the DNA science matter? Does the scientific evidence matter? It matters for a lot of people. According to one survey, 16% of active church members describe themselves as very troubled by what's presented as DNA evidence, indicating that the Book of Mormon is not historical or does not match the DNA. And about 40% of church members, according to one study, indicated that they had doubt about whether the Book of Mormon was literal and historical. And my personal testimony is that the Book of Mormon is a literal historical account. And this presentation will talk about some of the evidence that supports that. Okay, so as Paul indicated, late last year, Rodney Meldrum had presented something, information about DNA evidence supporting the Book of Mormon, haplogroup X. Most of you, I think, will have heard some of his presentations about haplogroup X. So haplogroup X refers to a mitochondrial DNA. It's a matrilineal DNA. So it goes the mother's line, from the mother, the mother's mother, the mother's mother's mother. So a strict matrilineal line. And fitting with what Simon Southerton presented when he presented DNA evidence a few months ago. When they do this DNA research for the matrilineal line for Native Americans, what they find is that there are 5 authenticated ancient American matrilineal DNA types. 4 of them appear to be of Asian origin, which fits the traditional idea of an Asian migration to populate the Americas. One of the 5 matrilineal DNA types is mitochondrial haplogroup X, and it does not appear in Eastern Asia. And when you look in the old world as to where this DNA type occurs, the place where it occurs the most and with the greatest diversity is in the Middle East. And when you look at all of the evidence related to this DNA type, it becomes clear that that DNA came from the Middle East. Now, critics will say, well, maybe it came from the Middle East, but they think it came from the Middle East across Asia. They still think maybe it came across the Bering Strait, but there's no remnants, no DNA left behind of haplogroup X through Eastern Asia. It just doesn't fit the DNA evidence. So Mr. Meldrum in the past has presented this as arguments about haplogroup X, pointed to the Middle East as being the origin for this DNA type, which is authenticated as ancient in the Americas. And some have accepted that, many have attacked him. Those that criticize the argument that he presents largely do it with the argument that the haplogroup X may have come from the Middle East, but it came 16,000 years ago. And I'll address that in a little bit, the timing issues and when it actually came to the Americas. All right, so this is a map. This particular one can be found in Wikipedia. It shows for global distribution for haplogroup X, where among native populations, so this is looking at native populations, this DNA type occurs. And as you'll see, the 2 places where it occurs with the greatest concentration frequency is in the Americas and in the Middle East. And that there's virtually no occurrence across East Asia, such as you would expect if this had come across the Bering Strait. Okay, so again, sort of fitting with what I had said before, the Middle East is the most likely place of origin for haplogroup X. Sometimes critics say that maybe it came through Asia from the Middle East. Now there's another piece of it that's even more interesting. So among Native Americans who have this haplogroup X DNA, they have one of 2 types, X2A or XG. Most are X2A. Now X2A and X2G, these 2 Native American types, are co-located in the same groups. For example, they're both they have high percentages in Ojibwa tribes. And so it points to a common ancestry for those 2 Native American haplogroup X DNA types. But what's surprising is that X2A is actually closer related to what's found in the Middle East than it is to the other Native American DNA type X2G. So it's a surprisingly very strong correlation and connection between some Native Americans and the Middle East. All right, so the closest relative in the old world to haplogroup X2A, the Native American type, is X2J. Here's one of the locations that it's been found. It's in the Egypt area. You see Jerusalem up there, in the general location of the Middle East. Another occurrence was found in Iran. This is a very rare type. It's not something that's common. So there have actually only been 2 occurrences found in the entire world, but those are both in the Middle East. Okay. All right, so this is I put this to help illustrate as the sort of the family tree there for haplogroup X, simplified. All right, and I've colored here in red haplogroup X2A, X2G. These are red. These are what's found in North America. Okay, and so both of these descend from a haplogroup X2 DNA type, which is found primarily in the Middle East. okay? The X2A, the most common Native American DNA of this type, is actually more closely related to what I just mentioned, X2J in the Middle East, than it is to the other Native American X2 DNA type. So it's thought that the Native American X2A DNA type and the Middle Eastern X2J DNA type come from some not yet found common ancestor that likely came from the Middle East. Now, critics that say they don't want to accept a Middle Eastern source will sometimes point as an alternative source to X2E, which is found in the Altai region. It is in Siberia, but it's in Western Siberia, thousands of miles away from the Bering Strait area. So it's not in East Asia, and it's actually more distantly related than what is found in the Middle East. So, okay, and so that was the prior evidence that's actually been known a little bit, and we'll talk about the timing issues and the criticisms there and address those. There's another DNA evidence type which hasn't been previously presented until just recently, and this is a Y chromosome DNA type. So just like the previous one was the matrilineal line, the mother, 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 this one is the patrilineal line on the Y chromosome. So it's only tested in males, and then the father's father's father, so forth. And then this patrilineal DNA evidence, what they found when they've done this for Native American populations is that one of the DNA types they come up with is Y-DNA haplogroup R, which is not an Asian type of DNA. It's actually more commonly found in Caucasian type groups in Europe, the Middle East, and surprisingly, you know, a significant portion of Jews also have this Y-DNA haplogroup type. Now, when they found this among Native Americans, the general assumption and the common argument is that, well, it must have come over since Columbus. It's a Caucasian DNA type. It must have come up over after Columbus. But the problem with that is that it has been found in certain tribes. It's been found both too common and too diversely mutated to be fully explained by this. So for example, in the Ojibwa tribe, there are some of those tribes that over 60% of the men will have this DNA type, this Caucasian type DNA type. And when they are tested, these are people who claim and say that they're pure ancestry in that tribe. And so what they've realized is you can't have that high a percentage of these be from European intermixture since Columbus and still have maintained that the tribe and them thinking that they're pure Native American ancestry. And in addition, when they tested the DNA for specifics, they found that there are a number of mutations among the Native Americans with this DNA type, which isn't explained by recent admixture. So let me show that to you here. So first, this is like the prior, this is a global map of Native populations with this Y chromosome DNA type. As you see, it's found in the Native Americans in the Americas. It's not found in East Asia. Hopefully you'll see my mouse when I'm doing this, but if you don't, you'll still understand anyway. And then it is mostly found in Caucasian type groups, including the Middle East. Okay, so, and this is taken from one of the studies that tested the Native American tribes that had a high percentage of this Caucasian type Y-DNA. And so each of these dots, these blue dots, were different, slightly different DNA, which is shared with Europeans, okay? And then the purple ones, the purple were what they were finding in these Native Americans. The abbreviations represent the different tribes that they were testing. I don't have the legend here for it. But the purple ones were not found in Europe. So it's a European or a Caucasian DNA type, but it's not found among current Europeans. But they felt was maybe close enough that could be explained by recent mutations since Columbus. But then they found some additional ones which were put in orange here, which represented many mutations, as many as 8 mutations from any European DNA type that they could find. And they're thinking it's just too many mutations to have occurred in the time frame since Columbus to fully explain this as being from recent admixture. So interestingly, when you look at the mitochondrial, the matrilineal DNA type haplogroup X and where it occurs among Native Americans, and where you find this Caucasian type patrilineal DNA type haplogroup R and where that's found among Native Americans, they actually match, they correlate, they seem to indicate that it is indeed a common ancestral population that's of a non-Asian source. Now, the general scientific, the non-members, you know, in the science, they say, well, they explain this by saying, well, the one on the left there, haplogroup X, that came 16,000 years ago. We think that was way before the Book of Mormon times. But then on the right, they say the Y-DNA haplogroup R, that came after Columbus. But when you look at them, it seems clearly that they're a common ancestral group. It doesn't fit. It doesn't fit. The one being too old or the other being too new. A Book of Mormon migration would explain what you're actually seeing in the data. All right, so now let's take a little look briefly at blood types. So blood types are also genetically inherited. You can also look at those and test those for ancestry. All right, when you look at the blood types, it also shows that the commonly held belief that all Native Americans originated solely from Asian migrations, it doesn't match what you see in the blood types either. The blood types also point to a different ancestry mix. So let's take a look at the maps for that. So for example, when you look at blood type B, you see that it's a very common blood type in Asia, but almost never occurs among Native Americans. Similarly, when you look at blood type O and blood type A, you see blood type A is relatively common in Asia, but not in Central America or South America, where you see that blood type O, almost all Native Americans are blood type O. Another interesting thing you see is that similar to what you saw with the matrilineal DNA, haplogroup X, and the patrilineal DNA with haplogroup R, that northeastern North America seems to have a different ancestral population type. So you see different blood type mixtures and percentages than what you see in the rest of the Americas. So that also fits what you were seeing in the DNA evidence. In addition, with the blood types, many Native Americans have a unique variant of blood type O. And I have it's a blood type, it's known as O1VG542A. Okay, so it's a variant of blood type O. It doesn't have any functional impact on the blood type. There's still blood type O. It's what's called a neutral variant, but it's something that they can test for ancestry. And this particular Native American unique blood type variant is found in many tribes in both North America and South America, indicating that it comes from some ancient common ancestry, this blood type variant, but it has not been found in Eastern Asia. It has been found in an individual in the Middle East, and there's no known historical explanation for that connection. So that too could relate to the Book of Mormon. Now, this blood type variant, there has not been a whole lot of testing, Globally, some more testing needs to be done to confirm that connection. But at least so far, it's not been found in East Asia, has been found in the Middle East, but is almost always where it's located is among various Native American tribes. Okay, so now let's talk about the criticisms and address those. So again, as argued before, the main argument that Simon Southerton and others have made arguing about the DNA have argued that the haplogroup X came before the Book of Mormon times. Those that have addressed the Y DNA, the recent Y DNA evidence, say that that came after Book of Mormon times. So to understand the timing issues, first, let's understand how they come up with those dates. The way they come up with those dates is through evolutionary theories. And so, as I indicate there, it's based on the idea that humans evolved over millions of years from a common ancestor with chimpanzees. And so what they do to figure out these things, they say, okay, we will assume that it's true that humans evolved from common ancestor with chimpanzees. We'll assume that that occurred over X million of years. And then based on those assumptions, if you assume those two things, then you can look at, okay, so how many mutations have there been? And with that, they come up with an estimated average mutation rate. And they call this a molecular clock. And then they use that to estimate migration dates. So for example, if they assume the evolution, they assume that it happened over X million years. From that, they have a mutation rate. And from that mutation rate, they then say, okay, now we've got these Native Americans, we've got these ancestors in the old world, there's this many mutations. So they would say, okay, on average, that looks like 16,000 years ago. So what you can see from this is it's an estimation based on assumptions. It's not based on a data where they can say, yep, that was 16,000 years ago. They're doing it based on assumptions about mutation rates based on evolutionary theories. Okay, now there is some carbon dating that can also be done. The carbon dating isn't what shows the 16,000 years ago, though. That's based off of this evolutionary theory and molecular clock theory. Okay, so just commenting on the molecular clock is not a reliable method to estimate migration dates. It's based on these evolutionary theories. Now, there are very few circumstances where they can try to directly study and test what are the actual mutation rates that they can see. One of the ways they can do that is there are some long-term pedigrees of ancestry where they do happen to have a skeleton, mummy, body, whatever, from an ancient person, and then they test the descendants, and then they can say, okay, well, how many mutations happened in this known pedigree? When they've done that, it has not been anywhere close to what they're assuming of the molecular clock. Instead, it's not clock-like at all. It's random mutations, so it can be short, fast, whatever, but usually it's many times faster, or the mutations are occurring many times faster than the assumed rates in the molecular clock. And then in addition, as I put on the slide, even if the evolutionary theory, the average mutation rate were correct, there just haven't been enough mutations that have happened for the DNA types here with the Native Americans to be able to be confident that in the time estimates that it gives. So that's the argument related to the timing issues for the DNA evidence we presented before. There's one other timing issue for haplogroup X. This one just applies to haplogroup X, and that is an individual named Kennewick Man. And Kennewick Man was an ancient Native American. His skeleton was found in the Washington State area. On the slide, these are artistic recreations that were made based off of the skull. And Kennewick Man turns out to be haplogroup X. So it's kind of an exciting and interesting thing. So he fits this haplogroup X DNA type that connects with the Middle East. And he's clearly an ancient Native American. Now, the critics use the carbon dating, though, to say, okay, well, this proves that haplogroup X came over before the Book of Mormon timeframes, because the carbon dating is commonly indicated for Kennewick Man to place him over 8,000 years ago, usually about 9,000 years ago. So they, assuming this, if this were correct, then it would show that haplogroup X had come to the Americas at least the 9,000 years ago, which would have been before Book of Mormon timeframes. So that's the primary attack on haplogroup X DNA. However, what most people don't realize is that there are actually a number of carbon tests that were done for Kennewick Man, about 20 of them. And they were ambiguous. They were not all at that 9,000 years ago range. I put them on the slide there. You can see the actual dates that were produced. These are written in a years before present unadjusted ages. So it's simplified. But as you'll see there, 5 of the 20 dates actually generated carbon dates that were reasonably within Book of Mormon timeframes. And so the question is, well, wait a second, some of these actually produce timeframes that are consistent with the Book of Mormon, and how do we know which of the carbon date tests are correct? So let's talk just about that briefly. So this is an image of the location where the Kennewick Man skeleton was found. He was not actually found in the riverbank. He was found when the skeleton had eroded out. The water had eroded the skeleton out. So the skeleton had eroded out and was in the water. But with some of the sediment still stuck to the skeleton, they could correlate and figure out where in the depth-wise he had been located in the soil. Now, when they've examined Kennewick Man, it became clear that he had been given a protective burial. He hadn't just died and laid there. And the way they can tell that is that the remarkable preservation of the skeleton, there's no animal scavenging on the skeleton and things like that. So it's indicative of a protective burial. And so that's key for the dating of Kennewick Man. The location that he fits was actually just inches, with less than 10 inches, just a few inches actually below a volcanic ash line. So Mount Masama had exploded, there's a volcanic ash layer that had been in the soil, and he was buried just a few inches below where that volcanic ash layer was. Now, a protective burial would require a burial of at least 20 inches deep. We know that the Mount Masama, that volcanic event, has been commonly dated as 6,730 years ago. So since Kennewick Man was given a protective burial, he had to have lived more recently than the Mount Masama volcanic ash event, which means that the 8,000 to 9,000 year old carbon dates are impossible. And if you eliminate those, the remaining carbon dates fit the Book of Mormon. Now there's another thing too, with Kennewick Man having been buried just below the Masama ash volcanic line, that not line, layer. Some people have said, well, wait a second, if he did live later or more recently than the Mount Masama volcanic explosion, and then he would have to have been buried down through that volcanic ash layer. Maybe you can tell whether he had any volcanic ash or products on the skeleton. Now, you wouldn't necessarily expect to find it. You might hope to find it, but his body had washed out, so it was no longer in the bank. So the soil around him had washed away. So you could only look at the sediments, the small amounts that were stuck to his skeleton, but it does turn out that some of the weathered volcanic ash product, there was some stuck to his foot, which indicates, again, to me that further proof that he lived more recently than that volcanic ash event, and that his dating is commonly used is incorrect. He actually lived more recently. Before we go on to that next point, there's one other point I want to make there. So some people ask, well, how is it that you get some carbon dates that are so far off from other carbon dates? What happens is, for carbon dating, it can be influenced by the surrounding. So for example, if you get a skeleton or something and it's up at the surface and it interacts with later newer roots or things, that can artificially make something look younger or newer than it really was. In the same way though, if the skeleton's in a location that with old carbon, older products like glacial meltwater or things like that with a very old low carbon level, you also get an artificial aging of the skeleton as it starts to take on the level of carbon of its surrounding environment. With Kennewick Man, the skeleton, when they tested the sediments around where he was located, what they found was artificial aging, not de-aging. In other words, the sediments in the area around him, not in every test, but in some of the tests, tested as much older, in other words, older than a volcanic layer, another volcanic layer even below him, the glacier peak ash level. So it fits that he was in a location in an environment that caused artificial aging and may have made the skeleton test in some of the tests as older than it really was. Okay, there's one other timing piece. We're getting near the end already of this part anyway. So Kennewick Man had a spear or arrow point lodged in his hip. And apparently had carried it for some time in his life because the bone had sort of grown around this spear or arrow point that is lodged in his hip. There are some people that point to that spear or arrow point, the point, and they say, oh, we think that's a cascade point. And cascade points were commonly used 5,000 to 10,000 years ago. And they use that as another piece of evidence to say that we think that shows that Kennewick Man was older and lived longer ago. But there are a couple of things to be careful about there. The first is that we don't have good evidence on the point itself. And this is because of the Native American Graves Protection Act. And some people may know that many Native Americans consider the burial places for their ancestors holy, the skeletons of the ancestors holy. They don't want them disturbed. And so Congress passed an act 30, 40 years ago that protects Native American skeletons from essentially scientific testing and prevents scientific testing from most Native American skeletons. And so that's why there's actually not a whole lot of evidence that comes out. Well, Kennewick Man was interesting because there was a dispute as to whether he was Native American or not. And because of that dispute, there was a time frame, a little window where a lot of testing could be done until it was determined for sure, okay, he is a ancient Native American, at which point he was then buried, not to be bothered or studied anymore. The spear, the arrow point in his hip, they were not able to remove that, and they would have had to have destroyed some of the bone. And so they're not able to do that because the Native Americans are watching very, very closely. And so the only evidence we have for the point is they took imaging. So it was a CT image, and there's only a small portion of the point that can be seen. And so from the imaging, there's dispute in the science. Some people think that maybe it was a cascade point. There are others that think maybe it was a Haskett point. There are others that say it could be a previously unidentified point. even the ones that say that it was a Cascade Point acknowledge that some of the common features are not exclusive to Cascade Point. So the bottom line is it's a relatively weak evidence. Also, something that Paul had mentioned before is true too, which is that even if it were a Cascade Point, which was commonly used 5,000 to 10,000 years ago, it doesn't mean that that was when Kennewick Man was hit with it, because points can be used later and have been picked up and used in later years and later times. So it doesn't necessarily point to the time frame either. Okay. Just a couple of interesting points about Kennewick Man's appearance. Many know that he has a very Caucasian looking appearance, and that was part of the reason there was a dispute as to whether he was Native American or not. The first person that saw him said, look, this is clearly a Caucasian type individual. He doesn't look like a typical Native American. The face is interesting, which is why I put it on the cover of my book and called it The Face of the Nephite, because of this interesting possibility of Kennewick Man being a Nephite or Lamanite, as it may be. When the scientist found it, he acknowledged, he says, my first thought was this was European, clearly a white person, a Caucasian. So that in addition to the haplogroup X, it's interesting that when you find an ancient Native American with this, when you actually get to see a skull with it, it actually fits the Book of Mormon in terms of the appearance as well. All right, I'm going to look at just a little bit of DNA related to Central and South America and then close. All right. There's a third type of DNA testing called autosomal DNA testing, and there it's not just the straight matrilineal or patrilineal. It's more of a panoramic view of the DNA. When autosomal DNA is presented, they use colors. And so here you can see on the left, and there's African DNA types that kind of use an orange coloring for those of African ancestry. East Asia, those with the East Asian DNA type, they put with this pink coloring for those with that kind of ancestry. For Caucasian DNA types, and many people don't realize this, but it's not just the Europeans, but the Middle East and Central and South Asia also fit this same Caucasian DNA type. So what you see is Europe is all this blue, we'll call it a Caucasian DNA type. Middle East also is mostly blue, a Caucasian DNA type with a little bit of African descent mixed in. Same with like in Central and South Asia, it was actually mostly a European DNA type with a little bit of Eastern Asia mixed in. For the Americas, they give the unique Native American ones a purple coloring, a different coloring, and we'll do a little focus on that. So let's focusing on that part with the Native Americans. What you see is that while a lot of the ancestry is uniquely Native American, maybe Asian ancestry, likely Asian ancestry for the majority of it. There are some tribes where you see a significant amount of this blue Caucasian DNA types. And these three where you see the most actually fit that Northeastern Native American tribes group where you're seeing high percentages of a Caucasian DNA type. But that's not the only location you find it. You actually see it across the Americas, just in smaller portions. Like for example, here the Maya, you see it a little bit too. And these are when they're tested, they do some questions to see if they appear to be pure ancestry, and of course sometimes it turns out not to be true. But so when they test this, they will say, well, we'll just assume that they weren't actually pure ancestry and that there was some intermixture after Columbus. But there was in 2018 a study when they looked at Central America and South America as well, and when they tried to look specifically at markers that match with Jewish and Mediterranean people, they found higher percentages than they expected based on the historical record. So there are small amounts that show up as well in Central and South America that could fit a Jewish ancestry as well. All right, and so that that finishes again the book, location where you can buy it if you're interested. The book, I think you'll find it understandable and accessible, but it also has the detailed sites. I relied on the peer-reviewed research as much as possible, and in the end, I think that the evidence does support the Book of Mormon. So, all right, and let me go ahead and stop sharing there. And all right, and then any questions that anybody wants to do?
Yeah, Dave, this is Ken Krogh. How are you?
I'm doing well.
Good. You mentioned that your findings align with the Gospel Topics essay. Could you take a minute and just talk about how that is the case?
Okay, yeah, I'd like to do that. There's actually a misunderstanding. And it surprised me, but it turns out there's a good chunk of members of the church that sort of misunderstand the Gospel Topics essay to mean that there's no evidence supporting the Book of Mormon and there never will be. That's not what it says. What it says is very clearly that the evidence at that time that they wrote it was inconclusive and tentative, but that the evidence at that time neither proved nor disproved the Book of Mormon. And so since then, what I've added is there's additional evidence that now exists, but I would say that it is still true that the evidence does not necessarily prove the Book of Mormon, because there still are places for doubt. As discussed, for example, there's the issues of the timing of the DNA, when it really came. There are other things that you could still look at and say, okay, it doesn't prove it one way or the other. But that's what it does. In my view, it's not inconsistent with the Gospel Topics essay. I will note too that in the Gospel Topics essay, a lot of people say, okay, well, that's the church that wrote it, and that's not exactly true. They say in the essay they thank various scientists for their contributions in writing it, so they acknowledge that the scientific portion of it was provided by scientists that was then approved for publication, but they never stated as like, this is the official church position and will never change. In fact, they've changed it a few times since they first published it.
So would you say the dating is the primary issue of difference?
Absolutely. That is
anything else?
That is the sole critical issue. It's the dating.
Gotcha. And I know that Matthew Harris on Amazon has just come out with a book that talks about the Gospel Topic essays and actually names the names of the scholars who wrote each one, which he wasn't authorized to do, but he did it anyway. So that one's interesting. Well, thank you. That's helpful.
Well, thank you, Ken.
I've got a question. This is Ron
Yes.
Smith. So I understand how mitochondrial DNA follows the matriarchal line. I understand how the Y chromosome follows the patriarchal line.
Yep.
The third one, I wasn't sure. The autosomal, I think, is what you said. Could you just say how that fits in with
so with the autosome, those aren't the matrilineal and the Y chromosomes. Those aren't the only levels areas they can test. They can test, all across all kinds of DNA. The problem is that there's so much information, they can't handle it all. And so what they do is they kind of have found sample markers and tests across sort of a panorama, right? Across of all the ancestry, and they find certain types that fit certain ancestry. And so like there are certain markers across your DNA that show, for example, an African ancestry, that show an East Asian ancestry, etc.
So these are basically statistical markers. I mean,
they're looking for actual mutations. They just take samplings of them across the DNA.
Okay. Well, it's been a while. Like 40 years or 50 years or maybe even 60. I forget how long it was since I had biology. What's an autosome?
I'd have to prepare a good definition for that. So
Okay.
the autosomal DNA is when they're testing across. But
Okay.
I don't have it. I'm not
I'll-
prepared with the definition.
I'll accept that.
I thought they sold car parts.
Autosome, yeah.
I have a question.
Hi, Dave. This is Josh Daly. How are you doing tonight?
Doing well.
The presentation. I just had a couple questions. In my background, I took a couple classes in population genetics, and although it's been a decade, so I'm out of touch. But I thought the main challenge with DNA in the Book of Mormon was more along the lines of challenges with genetic drift and bottlenecks and there's another one too that I've read about, and those seem to be really limiting factors to even conduct the study. I'm not refuting anything you've presented tonight, but I think those are challenges, and I just didn't see those challenges addressed in the presentation exactly. So
Okay, yes. So what you say is true. The Gospel Topics essay, that's where it kind of spends its time and energy in looking at. So when it says there's the evidence is tentative, inconclusive, doesn't prove or disprove the Book of Mormon, one of the things that they then spend a few pages on is why you would not necessarily expect to see DNA evidence that you can say, okay, yes, this is Book of Mormon DNA, right? And they look at genetic drift, they look at population bottlenecks as explanations as to why you can't necessarily expect to see a DNA from a Book of Mormon group that was in the Americas. But despite those limitations, what I'm presenting is that despite those limitations, you can actually see some things that do point to a connection.
Are you saying the Kennewick man
Thank you.
were you saying the Kennewick man might be Nephite, or just he might be around at that era?
So my theory is that Kennewick man fits those newer carbon dates, that 2000 to 2600 carbon date. And if that is the case, then he's in the time frame of the Book of Mormon in the Americas, and he has the haplogroup X DNA, which connects to the Middle East. And so that's all there is. So based off of that, there is a possibility that he could be a Lamanite or Nephite from the Book of Mormon.
You were saying he had Caucasian features. Now, does that mean he's also Middle Eastern as well, or?
Yeah, so sort of what I explained with the one. A lot of times people think, okay, Middle Eastern, that's not Caucasian, but genetically, they're in the same boat. Okay, so when you look at the ancient Middle East, the time frame of the Book of Mormon, those individuals have what would be called a Caucasian DNA. It's a Caucasian DNA type with a little bit of African mixture. I could pull that slide back up, but that's the DNA type that you would see. And in terms of just the appearance of them, they would have had more of a Caucasian type appearance than an African type appearance or East Asian type appearance.
So David, have you had any notable interactions with scholars who have, felt like maybe you're bringing some new data points to light here, perhaps even to the point of re-looking at the Gospel Topics essay, or maybe adding updates to it? Not
yet. I hope for that to happen. So as Paul gave with my introduction, I'm a patent attorney, and this was, so the way I got into this was really out of personal interest. When I started to look at the information Rod Meldrum had presented, I read the Gospel Topics essay. I wanted to know for myself what the evidence really was, and I just sort of started researching on my own through the peer-reviewed literature and came up with what I have. So this is newly presented, and unfortunately, it's not yet widely or well known. The interactions I've received have mostly been from faithful members who say great, and a couple of anti-Mormon scientists who say you don't know what you're talking about. And so at the end of the book, I have a what I call a frequently asked questions section where I've addressed some of the criticisms or questions that have been raised about the research.
Question. Paul, thank you for inviting me to your group. I'm probably the only non-restorationist, non-Mormon in this group. I actually come from an evangelical, charismatic, Calvinistic background, but I'm very fascinated in all things Mormon. So are there any secular scientists that I believe that the later dates, those 5 later dates that you gave us, is anybody advocating that? Are anthropologists, any scientists who are secular, not necessarily anti-Mormon, but just secular, that would accept these dates and would advocate for them? And also, essentially, it seems to me, looking at your model, it appears your model basically assumes a young Earth creation. Is that a safe assumption to make?
Okay, so I'll take both. So the first question was, are there any non-member scientists who have come out and said, yes, you're correct on, or would have accept or say the more recent dates for Kennewick Man? The answer is, so far, I'm the only one with a theory on Kennewick Man with the younger dates. Now, they would accept and agree that 5 of the 20 carbon dates did test in the younger time frame, but they have generally dismissed those and gone with the older dates. And so it's a matter of logic and argument that I've presented about the burial to show, and the circumstances of the burial to show that the younger dates are actually more consistent with the burial circumstances than what's commonly accepted in the literature. But I would agree with you that in the literature, what's generally accepted is the older dates and not the more recent ones for Kennewick Man. Now, there are non-member scientists who would agree that, for example, with the Y DNA haplogroup R, that it doesn't seem to be only since Columbus. The Solutrean hypothesis, people have sort of picked up the information about that and the haplogroup X, and have tried to argue for maybe a European migration. They don't go towards the Book of Mormon, so they try to go towards a Solutrean theory for explain that kind of non-Asian ancestry that they are finding among the Native Americans. And then you asked another one, is my theory, is it based on a young Earth? And the answer is no. So actually, that's something I've tried to avoid taking a position on. I do note that in terms of the molecular clock, that and the dating use of that for dating of the migration dates, molecular clock is based on a full evolutionary theory of common ancestry with chimpanzees over millions of years. And so it is true that I say that's an assumption that's not necessarily reliable. But even if that were true, you still would have the problem of it's not a whole lot of mutations that have occurred. And so you still have the whole situation of, even if that were true, have there been enough mutations that you can reliably say, yes, this is the time frame that would have taken. The fewer mutations you get, since they're not clock-like, the harder it is to say whether it took a long time or a short time.
Let me get a thank you in here, David. I really do appreciate your presenting your perspective for us this evening. I would like to thank you for your question too, and let me side with those that see the lanceolate point as at least 5,000 years old. And while it's not a really well-made one, the lanceolate points characteristically are going to be 5,000 to 10,000 years old. David has already cited me as pointing out that they can be reused later, but again, I would point out that I think that's a rare development, but it is clearly a possibility. I do want to point out that we've reached the 9 o'clock termination time for our session. However, it is our usual practice to leave the floor open as long as our guest is willing to continue to answer the questions. And where the floor is open for you to continue. And I very much appreciate the excellent quality questions so far. And the floor should remain open if David is willing to take the questions.